Okay, so now I want to move into sort of the rest of the enolate chapter where we explore different methods used to form carbon-carbon bonds from the alpha carbon. And the first and simplest of these is simply alkylation. So this is a two-step procedure. The first is to generate an enolate. We'll do that with some sort of strong base. I'll give examples. The second step is going to be to add an alkyl halide electrophile, where this is some sort of primary sp3 carbon with a good leaving group. That leaving group, commonly bromide, iodide, those are best. Chlorides work as well. So let's talk about different types of enolates and how they are generated.